Hello, hello. Welcome to another edition of AuthZed Office Hours. My name is Sohan Maheshwar. I have with me Jimmy, one of AuthZed's co-founders, one of the original authors of SpiceDB. And today we're going to be talking about migrating off of AuthZed Serverless. A whole bunch of things to talk about the AuthZed Serverless product and the migration path. But Jimmy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Selman.
Yeah. Let's dive straight into it. Was it 5 years ago, Jimmy, when AuthZed launched serverless? It seems like a long time ago.
Yeah, almost maybe something around there, maybe five and change now. Um,
Hmm.
I think right before this call, we kind of like asked this question, and I dug through the commits, and the first commit was in December of 2020. So
Okay.
yeah, been
Okay.
over five. That's not necessarily when we launched it though, but that's when the first code commit happened. But back then, you don't have any customers or anyone yet, so committing the code basically is launching it.
Yeah. Nice. So, if you've been using AuthZed Serverless, you might have received an email that has said that AuthZed Serverless will be deprecated soon. And of course, we have AuthZed Cloud and self-hosted and a bunch of other options. So we'll talk through that in today's live stream. Jimmy, let's kick things off by asking, why was this built and what did it look like back then?
Yeah, so serverless was actually the first product that the company built. Um, just to like really make this concrete, serverless predates SpiceDB being open source. So we actually open sourced SpiceDB in September 2021. Um, Now, SpiceDB, the code base existed and we were using it at the time, but it was not open source, like an open source project in the community at that point. So serverless really was the first attempt at AuthZed monetizing this technology. The ideas was basically the future of databases. All these database companies out there are trying to basically re-architect systems that they had built to be serverless. They wanted to use disaggregated storage and kind of have a multi-tenant service where they had all their customers kind of running on one unified platform. So naturally, if you start a new database company, it seems pretty obvious that like your product is going to be based on top of some type of serverless architecture. You see this with other startups like Neon and Planet Scale and things like that, right?
Mhm.
So for us, it seemed like that was a pretty good bet for the architecture for our first product. Um, Ultimately, it was not a great fit, and we can talk about that a little bit more. Um, but it wasn't until kind of 2022 that we built and launched our dedicated product, which really became like the core product for us at the company. And we learned a lot of lessons through that process. And then it was August of last year that we launched Cloud, our latest product, and we can share even more findings and talk about like the lessons we learned from dedicated. So there's also been, 5 years of learning in that point in time for how people are using SpiceDB in real production workloads, and what actually builds a successful product that can sustain the company AuthZed, and by that, the development of the open source SpiceDB.
Yeah, and I feel that over the last 5.5 years, it's things that we learned from customers, but I think also the industry has evolved and requirements have evolved and things have become a lot more complex and things like that, which, is I think is par for the course in terms of evolution of a technology. So maybe let's talk about some of that you mentioned, Jimmy, about some of these things we learned while working with customers with dedicated and cloud and so on.
Yeah, so ultimately, I think we first have to talk about the differences between the products, like what is serverless versus cloud versus dedicated. Um, Serverless ultimately is the thing that I described before. It's kind of cheating. It's not like the full architecture where you have a disaggregated storage layer. Well, to some degree, it's not your typical structure that a lot of the other kind of relational services using this architecture are doing. But ultimately, you have a bunch of different users all using SpiceDB, and then sharing that kind of SpiceDB API service. And then there's a separate kind of storage layer. And then in that case, they are also actually sharing the storage layer. So it's a large multi-tenant architecture. And then dedicated was basically the idea that there are going to be some enterprises out there, and SpiceDB offers a lot of value to enterprises because they're the ones honestly feeling a lot of this pain. Like honestly, the most acutely of most customers, you really hit most pain points with authorization at scale, or when you have lots of different products and teams you're trying to integrate with. So we had this hypothesis that those types of users were not just going to self-serve sign up for a serverless product, and that ended up being true. But ultimately, the idea behind Dedicated was having a fully isolated environment. So we spin up in our own cloud accounts dedicated to each individual customer, their own environment. It comes with a control plane. That control plane can then be manipulated with an API to provision infrastructure and scale dynamically. But then they get to provision resources onto dedicated hardware running inside of that cloud account. And then that cloud account can be privately peered directly with their own internal networks. So nothing is necessarily exposed to the internet. It's all private. All the resources are dedicated to them. And
hence the name Dedicated.
Yeah, hence the name Dedicated, exactly. At the time, I feel like it is like a private instance of your own AuthZed kind of cloud. And honestly, like private cloud also comes to mind when it comes to naming, but private cloud also had an implication. I don't know if people remember before like the cloud was ubiquitous and AWS, like it was the default, people were calling Amazon the public cloud and they were calling like the on-prem data centers private cloud. So that name is kind of like overloaded. So we kind of wanted to avoid calling the product that. But
naming is hard, man. Naming is hard.
Yeah, naming is always the hardest part. You can spend however many hours building your product, but at the end of the day, you're never going to come up with a name that satisfies everybody. So ultimately, we actually learned a lot through doing that. Honestly, the isolation mattered not just from like a security perspective. Not only enterprises were coming to us and were telling us that, hey, SpiceDB actually stores security critical data. We don't want our data commingled in a multi-tenant service. That wasn't just the big folks that wanted that. That was just like small startups sometimes, but medium businesses as well.
And what could happen if something like this happened to me? Like, say you're like a large company and you're running, it's commingling with other services on a piece of hardware. What implication does that have?
I think it's really just about the security boundary of if one of those servers gets hacked.
Got it.
Yeah, our all the customers' data can be exposed all at once. It puts a single target in place rather than a bunch of small targets. How it works with Dedicated now is like if theoretically one of our customers were to get or to have a vulnerability and to get hacked, the blast radius would be contained to just that particular customer because we're using completely separate cloud accounts. There's no way to break out of the cloud account and hack the other ones. So very much so limits that kind of damage blast radius for what is seen as some very, very security critical data. The nice kind of side benefit to having all kind of dedicated resources was also that the customers themselves got dedicated like hardware, like the VMs they were running on. So they didn't actually have any problems with traffic from other customers impacting their own traffic. SpiceDB gets deployed into latency critical scenarios. So every millisecond counts. If someone else is sending a bunch of traffic and at the same time, you're also trying to hit a low latency, like a couple millisecond permissions check, you can spike that, and the other customer can impact the performance of your service. So someone doing a backup and restore might impact your like real-time production workload. That was like a huge problem we actually just had with serverless, and ultimately ended up recommending folks only use serverless for kind of evaluating SpiceDB in a quick way later in its life because of that kind of caveat with performance. We've done a bunch of more work kind of in SpiceDB to help improve that over time. More recently, introducing kind of rate limiting functionality into the enterprise version to try to help kind of avoid that in the future. But ultimately, you really need to be a single tenant to guarantee this stuff, because at the scale where you care about each individual millisecond, most type of rate limiting algorithms or services you could use to try to help avoid the impact of other workloads, it's usually reactive and not proactive. So it can be very, very tricky to still guarantee you're not going to impact performance without a coordinated rollout across teams. That just doesn't work across customers.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, right? And also I think purely from like an internal point of view, that is AuthZed. We're a startup, and so now we have dedicated. We launched Cloud last year, and we had serverless. So like there are like 3 different products almost of, like an engineering team maintaining and SRE teams working on and so on, which also is hard.
Yeah, I didn't even get into Cloud yet. So Cloud basically takes all the learnings we had from dedicated and comes full circle back to serverless and says, hey, not everybody wants to pay for a completely isolated environment. We have learned that having dedicated hardware for your deployment of SpiceDB really makes a difference for that performance. And having the data isolation makes perfect sense from controlling kind of the security blast radius. But not everyone cares that they're running on a completely isolated, separate kind of underlying compute control plane, basically Kubernetes, right? They don't necessarily care. And that's not a huge deal if you don't have particular regulatory requirements or anything like that. And really what that lets us do is not actually have folks have to pay for that first underlying set of compute deployed into a particular region like we would do in the dedicated environment, because everything is dedicated to those customers. So the idea with that was we literally took the same code base as dedicated and made it self-service. So folks can go to AuthZed.Cloud and sign up there and create permission systems. And the compute will be dedicated to them. They can scale it up and scale it down dynamically and kind of get a lot of the goodness that we get out of our dedicated environments just completely on demand and self-service.
Nice. And yeah, I remember we had a launch last year in August. We did a live stream then as well. So yeah, and talking about, going from dedicated to cloud and sort of sunsetting serverless. Yeah, let's maybe talk a little bit about how that also slowed down like the development within AuthZed, because we are focusing on the dedicated product and the cloud product right now.
Yeah, really, because serverless was literally written before we even open sourced SpiceDB. There's tech debt. I'd be lying if I said there wasn't any. And one of the things we were actually using serverless for was actually just our first target that we would deploy new releases of SpiceDB to. So we'd cut a release of SpiceDB, we'd push it to serverless. We have staging environments as well and things like that and test suites. But ultimately, the first like real environment that SpiceDB release would hit would be serverless. And then ultimately, we would start promoting it through the different rings of stability for each of our like dedicated customers, for example. But really, the tech debt made us not just immediately be able to deploy to serverless whenever we cut SpiceDB releases. We normally had to stop and patch a specific version of SpiceDB that was built just for serverless. Because serverless had all kinds of limitations. To get kind of the multi-tenancy, we actually still do until we actually sunset it. We require prefix on all the relationships and object types that you're defining in your schema, just so we have some identifier that like these are your resources. And then there's additional logic in serverless to actually constrain SpiceDB down, so you can only see the things with your particular prefix. That's kind of how we implemented the multi-tenancy. The prefixes are really awkward. You don't have to use those prefixes in open source or dedicated or cloud. And in fact, like some folks do want to use those resources because they like to namespace their definitions, but we're actually robbing folks from being able to actually take advantage of those prefixes for that, like for a use case like that, by us taking that use case and using it for the multi-tenancy. So like that created a little bit of an awkward UX.
Yeah, actually, I associate SpiceDB a lot with that, because I've been using it for like the last year and a half. And the first time I ever used SpiceDB was using AuthZed Serverless, right? And so yeah, that was my first like introduction to like creating a permission system and stuff. So yeah.
Yep, our guides would always have to have that. Like the getting started guide would have to have that. But then the whole annoying thing was you couldn't copy and paste examples because the account that you had created, or like the permission system you created in serverless, has a different prefix from the one in the guide. So we'd either have to make the guide templatable where you can like type your prefix in, right? But yeah, it was just kind of an awkward getting started UX. And also like it just didn't match open source SpiceDB. You want guides and getting started content to be consistent across your platform. And so having to say like, hey, there's a bunch of caveats when you're using serverless versus open source or dedicated, like that's just not a good experience. And it wasn't really for a good reason. So yeah, just between having to patch builds specifically for serverless and build features in, sometimes we just didn't make APIs available on serverless, period. So honestly, like it's not even a good representation of SpiceDB because you don't even get access to all the same APIs. Things like the watch API, we never made fully multi-tenant. So that just wasn't available on serverless. So it just wasn't representative of the experience running SpiceDB, even yourself. And so all dedicated and cloud are running real builds of SpiceDB. There's no modifications there outside of adding kind of enterprise features. So they have full access to the APIs. And so really it's kind of this combination of like, if we ever make an API change, do we have to go in and fix serverless for it? Do we just like add it to an allow list or block list for what APIs are enabled for serverless, and patching in the multi-tenancy where applicable, just slow down our velocity. And in general, we mostly had folks using serverless as an evaluation platform because once we realized that the performance, to really hit our performance numbers, you need dedicated hardware. We started to nudge people in that direction and message the product as being an evaluation platform. So most folks using it were not really using it in production workloads. And if they were, we usually would reach out to them as soon as they did and would kind of walk them through their use case and kind of understand and move them onto a more appropriate solution, whether that was self-hosting or dedicated or in cloud.
Okay, yeah. So let's maybe get into the specifics of like the sunsetting and stuff. But before that, quick shout out, folks, if you're just joining in, we are talking about AuthZed Serverless. The product is being sunset. The final date is April 5th, if I'm not mistaken, Jimmy.
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah. April 5th, yeah. And so this live stream will tell you how you can migrate off of it into either self-hosted or AuthZed Cloud and so on. And we were just setting up some context behind the product and, why it didn't really match or why it wasn't representative of SpiceDB. Let's get into the specifics now, Jimmy. Oh, and sorry, quick thing, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to put in the chat. Just also if you want to say hi or whatever, just drop it in the chat. But yeah, Jimmy, let's get into the specifics of the sunsetting itself. We spoke about why we're doing it, and we discussed how it's not representative of SpiceDB, etc. If someone's using it right now, either as an evaluation tool or as a developmental like staging type thing, what can we start doing?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways you can take it. You can either migrate to open source or you can migrate to cloud. We really recommend if you're using it for a development workflow, anything like just testing, running against unit tests or integration tests, or just like locally for your own kind of builds that you're running on your laptop. That is the scenario where we recommend using open source, like fully. We have GitHub actions and things like that help automate kind of these integration test use cases. We have test containers like Docker's test containers that have builds of SpiceDB, all the ones you would use to test against. So we do have really good solution in that space, all open source and all that can be run locally on top of your laptop. For anything that's actually like a production workload, we recommend moving to cloud. And I can give us a demo and talk about how you can actually back things up from serverless and restore them into a cloud environment or to an open source version of SpiceDB. And we'll do that in a little bit here. It looks like we got a message in the chat though.
Yeah, we have a question from Big Bald Pirate. Not sure if you're going to cover this, but any suggestions? If I still have some workloads on serverless, but I'm also running AuthZed Cloud, do you have any guidance on merging? That's something we're going to talk about in a bit, right, Jimmy?
Yeah, we definitely, I would say Cloud lets you provision multiple permission systems. So if you still want to keep those kind of isolated, still running on the new platform, you can do that. Outside of that, I'm going to show you the tooling in a demo, which you would use to create a backup and restore. And we also have like bulk import and export APIs that you can use to move data from serverless or open source into dedicated, basically from any SpiceDB to any SpiceDB. The other thing to note that is a major difference between serverless and SpiceDB is the regional availability. So serverless was deployed in GCP US Central 1, but Cloud, AuthZed Cloud is available in 2 regions. It's available in AWS, EU West 1,
EU West 1, Frankfurt.
It's Frankfurt. I know it's Frankfurt.
Yeah.
I can't remember the code. I think it might be EU Central 1.
EU West 1, I think.
West
no,
1?
West is... No, you're right. EU West 1 is Ireland. Yeah.
Yeah. I believe it's EU Central 1. It's Frankfurt.
Okay, EU Central
and then
1,
the other one is US East 1, like AWS US East 1. So
yes.
We are, if you want other regions, feel free to shoot us an email. Right now, we're trying to just collect feedback for what should be the next regions we start adding to Cloud. But yeah.
Thanks for the question, Big Bald Pirate. And I've also dropped the link in the chat for one of the migrations pages in from our docs. I love the title, which is migrating from SpiceDB to SpiceDB. But you get what I'm saying. This is what Jimmy spoke about just now. I think the only prerequisite is downloading Zed, which is our CLI, which Jimmy, you will also be using and demoing right now. So
yeah. So let's jump into the demo. Right now, I'm looking at the serverless UI. Yeah, it's a blast from the past for me. I don't know how many
old
folks
logo
watching
and
this.
stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Completely old logo. Just goes to show you how long around this has been and how little we've really touched it since, as it's just been an evaluation platform. I'm just in one of my old permission systems. So you can kind of see I have a schema here. I can even like click in here and see what relationships. Oops. Wow. There you go. Demo gods. I think it's because I've had this tab open for a while. Either way, I wonder if it's just this. So that's down. Yeah, there we go. Cool. That's what happens when you leave a tab open overnight. So you can kind of see I have some relationships stored in here. Now we're just going to do equivalents in Zed. So if you haven't already installed Zed, you basically, I forget the exact command. Let's see if I can grab it really quick. I already have it installed. It's just a homebrew command. So this is the command you would run. Brew install authzed /tap/zed. And then once you have that, you can see I have Zed on my local machine. Zed works kind of similar to projects like Kubernetes. So I have a bunch of contexts, and those contexts are different SpiceDB servers that I have credentials saved for on my laptop's keychain. So if you're on macOS, this is going to use the native keychain. If you're on Linux, it's going to try to use the GNOME keychain or the KDE keychain. The CLI is going to try to adapt to whatever environment you're in. In the worst case scenario, it's just going to use an encrypted file on disk. So in here, you can see I've got a couple of different saved profiles, and I'm just going to use this one. Actually, we have
Jimmy, I was today years old. I'm trying to sound Gen Z. I was today years old when I realized you can do Z context ls. Like a pleb, I've been writing Z context list.
Oh yeah,
I could have saved so much time.
I've got some aliases in here, and I know all of them because I wrote most of the aliases. So people might learn a bunch of them now. The other cool thing with Zed is there's just like tab completion. So I didn't even really need to list that. I could have just typed Z context use and then started tabbing to do autocomplete. So I already have my credentials for the serverless that we were just looking at right here. So if I do schema read, we're going to see we actually get a warning because serverless uses non-standard builds of SpiceDB, which immediately is a red flag, right? But you can see this is the same schema that we were just looking at over here. And if I do Z relationship read, Jimmy test, which was my ridiculous prefix for the document type, we can see these are those same three relationships I was just looking at as well. Additionally, I'm just using the permission system as it exists in serverless. I can run a permissions check here. We can see that the user Fred can view the document for stock, right? Really standard kind of use case here. Great, so we're connected, we're using Zed, we're interacting with this kind of legacy serverless database. Now, the way we're going to take this is we're going to first take a backup of serverless, and then we can actually use that backup to restore into either open source SpiceDB or a cloud environment.
Right.
So I'm going to just run Zed backup create Jimmy test.back is just what I'm going to call it. I don't need to give any other arguments here because just like the previous commands, the context is being used for the server credentials, right? So it already knows how to connect and which permission system I'm talking about. Great. So it just created this backup file on disk called Jimmy test. You can see there weren't tons of data in here. So you can see like the rate at which it created the backup was like instant, and it didn't even get like a big number because there's just very few in here. There's one bit of functionality with the Zed backup functionality that's like really, really cool. It lets you basically introspect a backup on disk. So we have that backup file that I just created. We can say Zed parse schema, and then I can say Jimmy test.back, and we can see the schema of the backup file. So all that data is in here, and you can kind of introspect it. You can pipe it into any other kind of like Unix command line tools to process that schema, make changes to it. We can also do things in here. You actually probably saw this in the autocomplete text. We can also kind of modify that with some tools built into Zed. So for example, if I run this command, oops, that's the wrong backup file, test.back. If I run this command, which is the same exact command we just ran, but give it the prefix replacements flag, I can actually rewrite the prefixes that we had in here. So if you wanted to theoretically strip off those serverless specific prefixes on your object types and relationships, you can use this flag to do that. And this flag is supported on all of the backup commands. You can do this when you're creating the backup, when you're restoring the backup, when you're just like inspecting a backup like I did just now. So in this example, I just stripped off that Jimmy test prefix entirely, and you can kind of see just the prefixless types in here. That being said, if you are going to strip off the prefix, you might need to make changes to your application. That's actually called into SpiceDB. So throughout the rest of the demo, I'm actually not going to strip the prefixes. I'm just going to maintain them, and I'm just going to push the database as is to make it as compatible as possible with the application. We can also, just as a really quick one, we can also do parse schema, not just parse schema, but parse relationships. And we can see those relationships that I read earlier.
Nice.
Well, those are all stored in here.
Cool.
So if you're ever
we have sorry, Jimmy. We have a comment from Jerome Albert saying, I like this. Thanks, Jerome. Thanks for watching. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat. Yeah.
Cool.
Go ahead, Jimmy.
Yeah. Thanks for the comment. Yeah, basically, if you are trying to sanity check your backup, make sure all the data is there, doing any of that, this is a great time to do it. All while it's this backup file on disk, and we give you the tools to do so.
And also, just to clarify, Zed is not specific only to like serverless, right? You can do this with AuthZed dedicated or cloud, or even if you're just running SpiceDB on your laptop.
Yep, exactly. And we're actually going to use that functionality to actually do this migration and move this data from serverless into cloud. So next up, I'm going to swap back to Chrome, and I'm going to switch tabs. This is our AuthZed Cloud dashboard. I'm currently logged into my own organization called Jimmy Test. I don't have any permissions systems created, so I'm going to spin one up right now. I'm just going to use development. I'm going to call it test, and then I'm going to make it as small as possible because we don't need to go too crazy with this one. I'm going to provision it in US East 1 and only have a single replica of SpiceDB. If folks want to get started with cloud as well, we do have a starter program where folks can apply and give us a little bit of information and get some free credits to get started.
Yeah, that's a good call out, Jimmy. I'll paste the link in the chat.
Great.
Here we go.
Yeah, provisioning a cloud permission system does take a little bit of time. You can see that's what we're waiting for on the screen. That's because this is spinning up all dedicated hardware for this particular instance. So right now it's provisioning the data store, like the underlying data storage layer. Then it's going to provision the actual SpiceDB nodes. And then it's going to run any migrations against that data store for us.
Yeah. Also, just a quick call out to the Cloud Starter Program. Apply for it and you get like $700 worth in AuthZed Cloud credits. So you can, try out AuthZed Cloud and see the value of scalable authorization infrastructure. So yeah, just hit the link in the chat and you can get into the AuthZed Cloud Starter Program.
Great. I believe I can do this while this is still running, but the next step is we have to get credentials into Zed so that we can actually start modifying this this permission system once it's live. So actually, maybe I should wait. Okay. So we're going to jump into the access session to do that. If you've used any kind of cloud IAM system like AWS or GCP or anything like that, or Kubernetes, we have a very similar kind of setup for provisioning credentials for talking directly to SpiceDB in dedicated or cloud. You first create a service account. So I'm going to call this just Jimmy. Any interactions from Jimmy. And then we're going to create a role. I'm just going to call this role admin. God mode on this permission system. Right. And I'm just going to give we've got a nice helper here to just give me access to all of the APIs. This is actually a pretty powerful dashboard if you really want to dive into it, where we actually let you write cell expressions to limit what data you can actually perform these APIs on. So say you had a bunch of different applications all integrated with the same deployment of SpiceDB, you could say this set of this application, it's only going to be able to read these particular object types, nothing more, nothing less. And you can actually restrict that down, or maybe you have a service that's doesn't do any reads, but is just producing data and doing writes to SpiceDB. You can limit it to write only for SpiceDB, just the write relationships API call, and maybe even restrict that down to just the subset of like object types that service is responsible for writing. So you can get really, really fine-grained on the capabilities of the systems in here. But for the purposes of this demo, and usually if you're debugging and creating credentials for Zed, you should just give yourself all of them. It's just the easiest way to stay sane.
Yeah.
So now that I've created that role and I've created my user, I'm going to go into a policy and just basically bind those two together. Jimmy is admin is what I'm going to call it. Bind Jimmy to admin. These description fields are really useful if you have other reasons for why someone should have it. For example, I could put in something that makes more sense, like founders should be admin or something like that. But then I get this nice drop down. I get to pick Jimmy as a service account, and I get to say Jimmy should be admin. Obviously, if you create more of these things, you can choose from more of those options. The last bit now is, now that I've created a service account for myself and I've granted it the roles it needs to be able to interact with this cluster, I'm going to click into that service account, and then we're going to actually go to tokens. And I'm going to provision an API token for this service account. Service accounts can have multiple tokens associated with them. That's kind of table stakes for products where you want to be able to roll credentials without any downtime. You usually want to provision a new token before you revoke the old one to make sure that like both all the things that are running with that token can kind of make the transition to the new one before the old one starts being like is revoked and starts breaking API calls. So in here, I'm just going to call this Jimmy's laptop. Z usage for Jimmy's laptop. I'm going to copy that. So this is a secret. And I'm going to teach folks a trick here if they don't know about it. Well, first of all, I'm going to paste it just so I have it here.
Oh, no. Everyone look away.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to delete this right after this, so I'm not as concerned about that. But OK, so now I go back to deployments and we can look at kind of what's running. We can see there's a one-by-one deployment of SpiceDB running here created 5 minutes ago. I can click this nice connect button, and it's going to give me the Z command just with that token that we just provisioned templated out of it. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm just going to paste that back into my terminal as well, kind of delete that last part. It says where the token should be. The other cool thing, if you're not familiar with this in Bash, if you start a command with space or like any number of spaces, it doesn't save it into your history. So if you ever have something like credentials that you don't want to just have sitting in your Bash history or ZSH history, this is basically how you do it. Or if you've like popped a box somewhere and you're hacking someone and you don't want any traces of the commands you're running, you should start all of your commands with the space. So pro tips there.
Nice.
So I've now set this new context up. You can actually give it your own custom name here, but I've just used the default, which is US East 1. It's the particular region that we deployed into. But just by setting the context, we are currently in it. So if I say Z context ls, you can see the current context is now that new one that we just created. Great. And we can see if we try to read the schema, we get an error.
Yeah.
Which is, in this case, is actually great because the error isn't, you don't have bad credentials or like you failed to connect. It's telling us you tried to read a schema, but we connected to SpiceDB and we found there was no schema written yet. So we have got this brand new clean install SpiceDB, and the only command left now is a nice backup restore of the backup file that we had. So we run that and we see that it finishes. And then if we do a Z schema read, we'll get back that schema that was from serverless. So we can kind of poke around and see in here, maybe we'll see some metrics. Because we're not running like consistent traffic through here, there's really not a ton to look at just because this we're not actually using it in a production workload. So I can actually just write a for loop here that just calls that permissions check command from before. And we should start to see some metrics come in if we refresh. May take a second. There we
go.
We can start to see some metrics coming in now. So that basically concludes getting through cloud. You can see we're done that for loop now. If you wanted to do this with open source SpiceDB, it really is as simple as running SpiceDB. Let's see. So this is just the basic command for running SpiceDB serve. You give it a pre-shared key. Some random key is the one we use in all our examples. That outputs a whole bunch about the configuration of SpiceDB, but ultimately just tells you it's running properly. I have a Z context called dev, which is literally just how to connect to this local host on default. And so if I do a Z schema read here, we can see we get that same error. It connected, but there's no schema. And I can just do that exact same Z backup restore, and it restores it there. And if we do Z schema read, we can now see that I use that backup to restore into an open source version of SpiceDB running on my laptop. So that backup file is kind of like universal. You can use it against any version of SpiceDB. And depending on your use case, whether it's development or whether it's a real production workload, you can just restore it into cloud, or you can restore it into the open source version.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, a couple of very quick questions, Jimmy. So one is the schema that you just wrote to your local instance of SpiceDB. If you open the other tab, can you see like the call being made to SpiceDB right there?
Yeah, you bet.
Oh yeah. Okay, nice.
Yeah.
So okay, so schema has been
the demo is real.
Yeah. Okay, so schema has been written, the relationships have been imported, and then you read the schema, and all of that was done by the backup restore command in Z, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, nice. And another very, like, I think operational question, but when you first did the backup and you gave the name of the file, which in this case I think was Jimmy test.bak, is that the file format it expects, or is that just something you specified?
The file format, there isn't really a real file format for this. I just use .back because that's kind of a Unix-like convention for backup files. Under the covers, we use Avro as the kind of underlying file format, which is a binary one, and it's very ugly. If I was to cat it, you'd see a lot of binary characters, and then you'd see a bunch of string data for the actual like schema and relationships. But that includes, that file format basically has a custom schema for the file format itself, unrelated to the SpiceDB schema, that says like, this is how you parse this file. And then that basically just says there's going to be a SpiceDB revision, a schema, and then a set of relationships for that backup. Ultimately, like, that format could change over time, so we kind of just treat it as opaque, and we say, like, if you're trying to get data out of this file format, use the Z commands to do so. Don't try to parse it on your own. But it is us trying to use the most efficient in terms of bulk import and export migration for that data. So we're just trying to keep it on disk in the most efficient way for us to stream it back when we're doing the backup and restore.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah. Sounds good. Folks, if you have any questions, put in the chat. We'll probably go for a couple of minutes more and wait for a couple of questions. But Jimmy, I think that pretty much covered all you need to do to migrate from a current instance of AuthZed Serverless to either cloud or open source, right?
Yeah, the only final remaining thing you'd do is then update your applications that are making calls to SpiceDB to the new endpoint. And so our recommendation, if you can tolerate read-only downtime, is to put your service read-only, create this backup, restore it into the new environment, and then update the credentials for your application. And then roll your application so it's using the new credentials, and then you can turn read-write back on. But there are ways to do zero downtime where you're constantly kind of syncing continuously and then do a cutover point. That's a little bit more tricky, and we have built some internal tooling for that. I would say if you're in that scenario where you have such a critical workload, you can't afford any downtime, you should absolutely not be using serverless. But you should reach out to us, because we can help you migrate with zero downtime to something that you should be using, whether that's self-hosted SpiceDB or dedicated or cloud.
Yeah. I'm also going to pop this link up again if people are just generally interested in, reading about migrating from SpiceDB to SpiceDB. Do check this out. It's in the comments, but you'll also find this in our documentation. Cool. So, Jimmy, I don't think we have any other questions. And again, folks, if you do have any questions, feel free to jump into our Discord. I'm just going to pop that link up as well. Yeah, so it's authzed.com/Discord. I think it's discord.gg/SpiceDB as well. I think that's another URL, the short URL that we have. But yeah, if you have any questions about this, you can always jump into our Discord. Our engineering team hangs out there. I'm there. Jimmy's there as well. So we'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Should I just quickly look at the dates again in terms of the deprecation? So there will be a reminder sent to a bunch of customers who are using AuthZed Serverless, I think, in the first week of Feb. There'll be a final reminder in the first week of March. And again, April 5th is the day when AuthZed Serverless will be sunset. I'd love to have Joey on live stream, actually, nuking the project. Let's see if that actually happens. I think that'll be fun to see. But yeah.
Joey is super excited to remove the tech debt from this product. I think the funny thing also is just timing. It's always really hard to do any type of product launches around the beginning of April because no one will ever know if it's an April Fool's joke or
Yeah.
not. So that's why it's April 5th. This should give folks ample time since the first notification went out to serverless user. I think will be like 90 days in total. And y'all just saw it took me, I don't know, 10 minutes to actually do one of these migrations and walk through the whole thing and explain it to folks. So it should be a fairly quick lift for folks migrating off of this.
Yep. Yeah, I think we're almost out of time. One last shout out. Next week, CEO of AuthZed, Jake, will be talking about AI agents in a webinar and a talk that he calls Falsehoods About AI Agent Authorization, or rather falsehoods people believe about agent authorization. Super interesting stuff. I know everyone's talking about AI agents, and my LinkedIn's full of people talking about Claude, spelled with a W now, which is like this new bot that people are using on their Mac minis at home and stuff. So you don't want to miss this one. So do sign up for that webinar that's happening next week. Jimmy, final thoughts before we close?
No, honestly, I'm really excited to see what folks do with AuthZed Cloud, and I'm honestly most excited to not have our customers struggle through like the weird caveats that serverless provides, and instead have a way clearer path towards leveraging like all the great features of SpiceDB, whether it's open source or one of our products. So yeah.
Pun intended when you said the word caveats there. I don't
Yeah. There's a SpiceDB feature called caveats as well. And now I can't not say caveats whenever there's an applicable use case.
All right. Jimmy, thanks so much. And yeah, folks, feel free to reach out to us either on LinkedIn or Discord if you have questions about AuthZed Serverless. But until next week, see you soon. And thanks again. Have a good one. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.